Morning, everyone. We'll just give it a few minutes for everybody to get on board here. Okay, hopefully everyone's logged in, but if not, I'll just get through the intro slides, and you won't miss any of the important stuff that we're going to be talking about. So, good morning. My name is Jenna White. I'm a policy coordinator with the Invasive Species Center, and today we're going to be doing our August webinar, which is on organisms and trade. So invasive species that may have been delivered to your front door, which is a bit of a daunting thought, but they're readily available for pretty much anybody. So we'll get started, and I will just go forward here. So just to begin, just a quick land acknowledgement on behalf of the Invasive Species Center. So the Invasive Species Center honors the long history of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nations people on the lands now known as Canada, and strives to show respect to their ancestors, their communities, and to them individually. We greatly appreciate the significance of the lands, waters, and all living things, and offer our gratitude to the Indigenous people for their care and teachings about our Earth. Our relationship with Indigenous communities are important. We will continue to listen and learn on how we can be in good relationship with Indigenous peoples, the lands and waters, and all living things, and act accordingly. So the Invasive Species Center respectfully acknowledges that our head office is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Batchewana, and Garden River First Nations, as well as the longtime settlement of the Métis people in the Robinson Huron Treaty area. And I'm speaking to you from Sudbury today, which is the traditional territory of the Atikameksheng Anishinaabe. The Invasive Species Center is a not-for-profit organization that mobilizes action against invasive species that harm the environment, economy, and society. You'll see that we have the word mobilizes now in our mission statement, and that's just to reflect some of the work that we're doing to try to promote that on-the-ground action. So we're really happy to be doing that. And in addition to webinars like this, we have a lot of great resources on our website, including best management practices, species profiles, video recordings, newsletters, and blog content. So lots of great stuff. If you have any questions on invasive species, we might have the answer to them. So feel free to check that out after the webinar. We also have our newsletter that comes out every once in a while to give you an update on what we're up to. And it's a really great resource if you're looking for grant opportunities or other just information on latest updates on invasive species and what's going on in Canada. And lastly, we also have a training program that's a really great, it's got a couple of great courses on there with some really in-depth kind of information on different terrestrial species, as well as a couple other tree sort of species that we're looking at. So happy to have people looking at the training program. It's a great resource. And today we're going to be hearing from Andrew Drake. Dr. Andrew Drake is a research scientist with the Great Lakes Laboratory for Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So Dr. Drake's research involves ecological risk assessment, invasion pathways, statistical modeling, and the human dimensions of invasions with a primary focus on freshwater fishes. Dr. Drake has conducted research on the spawning ecology of grass carp in the Great Lakes and contributed to Canada's binational ecological risk assessment for grass carp in the Great Lakes Basin. Dr. Drake also led the Canadian ecological risk assessments of ballast water, live trade, and bait fish pathways, with a focus on how changes in propagule pressure would lead to risk reduction. So Dr. Drake has also conducted research to better understand human decision-making and risky behavior in invasion pathways. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Dr. Drake.
Thank you very much, Jenna, for that great introduction. I'm just going to get my screen sharing here, and I'm going to get you to hang on the line to be sure that you can see my slideshow when I do share it. Okay, so right now I have my slideshow up on the first slide. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, looks great.
And then if I click forward, you saw that okay?
Yep,
Okay, perfect.
All right,
great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenna. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to present this work today. And before I do, I'd just like to acknowledge that This work was led by Farah Chan. Farah was a postdoctoral fellow when she did this work. She's now a biologist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So I get to tell you about her exciting work, but she was the one that did this exciting work under the supervision of myself and Dr. Tom Terrio, who's a research scientist also with Fisheries and Oceans in British Columbia. So today we're going to be talking about invasive species in 3 different live trade pathways in Canada. And whenever I talk about invasive species in trade, I always like to start with this photo as an extreme example of what can go wrong when the wrong species are in trade. What you're looking at here is a photo of a 17-foot long Burmese python that escaped to the wild in the Florida Everglades. And what you're seeing in the stomach there is a white-tailed deer. The panel on the right is showing the extreme changes in small and large mammal abundance that are associated with both the pre and post period of having Burmese python in the Florida Everglades. And the working theory is that Burmese python escaped after Hurricane Andrew. The hurricane had disrupted a breeding facility. Burmese python were at that point kept in Florida as pets, but just kind of goes to show that you can have these kind of very unexpected events that lead to really significant species invasions in the wild. So, of course, today we're going to be talking about aquatic pathways. What you're seeing on the screen here are just some of the dominant pathways for aquatic invasive species to be introduced to and spread within Canada. And I always like to start these types of presentations by reminding folks that pathways are both the causes and the solutions for AIS introduction and spread. Invasive species themselves certainly get a bad rap. The species are simply just being moved to areas where they are exploiting the environmental conditions. It's the pathways that are allowing for those invasions to occur. And, if we could ever get to the point of effectively reducing species introductions through these pathways, we would have a real improvement on invasion rate and subsequent secondary spread of these species within Canada's aquatic ecosystems. So when we think about aquatic invasive species pathways in Canada, it's important to recognize that there are many pathways by which species can be introduced. Things like the aquarium and ornamental pond industry, the live food industry, commercial aquaculture, private aquaculture, even natural dispersal, recreational fishing, and shipping. And across these pathways, we see very different pathway attributes. We can think about some of these pathways are better at primary introductions, meaning pathways that move species across Canada's borders to become introduced within the country. And then we have pathways that function more as secondary agents of secondary spread. So those would be pathways that help distribute species within Canada, within and among different regions. Pathways can be intentional. So they can involve the intentional and purposeful movement of species. They can involve unintentional movement. So things like hitchhiking species, you can see the zebra mussels that are fouling that propeller in the photo. They can be legal activity, again, when they're intentional, and they can be illegal activity, right? So they can be kind of vandalistic behaviors that people might have, moving species that are illegal to be possessed within Canada. And they can be both, pathways that are driven by industry or driven by members of the public or other stakeholders. And when we think about pathways, pathways themselves are typically understudied compared to invasive species. And, we see this in terms of risk assessment methods for pathways varying quite widely. The inset photo there is showing some work we've done on the ballast water pathway and the effect of different ballast water management measures. And here, in this case, we were looking at trying to estimate a species invasion rate associated with this pathway per year, whereas some other work we've done has looked at simply the rate of secondary spread. So it really gets back to that point that, the way you assess a pathway really depends on kind of what actions it's having on the landscape, how it's operating, primary versus secondary spread, and so on. Pathways are also really challenging to understand because there's a really large role of human behavior. typically we're working with trade data, we're working with human demographic data, we're trying to understand aspects of human behavior. And all of this is very different than the training that a lot of ecologists have when they get into the field of invasion ecology in general. So this is just my pitch to kind of, I guess, remind folks of the variety of pathways that exist and why the study of pathways is both important and challenging. So when we think about how do we better manage invasion pathways, it's helpful to be reminded of the typical invasion process. So we have a source pool of organisms. There will be some probability of transporting organisms from their source ecosystem to a destination or a recipient ecosystem. And it's this probability of transport and the number of species that have been moved per unit time. So you could think about, the number of species moved per year that we typically refer to as propagule pressure. And this entire talk is really focusing on the importance of propagule pressure and trying to estimate propagule pressure in 3 different live trades in Canada. So propagule pressure is really just introduction effort, or the number of species that we've moved per unit time. And of course, not all introduced propagules will survive. Only some fraction of those introduced propagules will actually survive the recipient environment. And if we can kind of track this framework, what it means is that we have the ability to understand the number of surviving propagules in the recipient environment, and we can then make some estimates or projections around the probability that those propagules will establish. And so folks may have heard the term risk-release relationship that's kind of shown in that dashed line in the bottom. And that describes how a given number of surviving propagules would lead to a given probability of establishment for a given invasive species. And there's a lot of work being done trying to understand that relationship across species and ecosystems. And so my kind of argument to you would be that this all comes back to the importance of understanding propagule pressure in invasion pathways. And if we can understand propagule pressure, there's really 3 key advantages. The first is we can develop dose response relationships for the arrival and establishment of invasive species. So we can say, well, look, if we knew there were 10,000 goldfish introduced per year and we had, 10 invasions or 100 invasions, that tells us something about how a given dose of goldfish release would lead to a given response in terms of invasion rate. We can also start to really test ideas or hypotheses about what are the factors that would drive species establishment across landscapes. So we can say, well, if we had, 100,000 fish introduced to this ecosystem, but 0 invasions over a period of time, that tells us something about the suitability of that recipient ecosystem. And then finally, and I think the most important one here is that if we have a better understanding between propagule pressure per year and the probability of establishment, it really helps us understand how our management measures that are aimed at reducing propagule pressure would lead to a given outcome in terms of the number of invasions avoided or a reduction in invasion rate per year. So that really gets to, helping us do cost benefit analysis. What does reducing propagule pressure do in terms of avoiding a given number of invasions per year? So with all of that said, our objectives of this work were to focus some of these concepts on the aquarium, water garden, and live food pathways in Canada. And so objective 1 here was to determine the number and the spatial distribution of different pathway components. So ports of entry, distributors, and retailers for live food organisms in these 3 pathways within Canada. Number 2 is to determine the number and spatial distribution of end users, meaning, members of the Canadian public that either buy aquarium species or water garden species or buy live food, and their potential rates of release. So of course, release is illegal, but what are those kind of inadvertent release rates that we see year after year? And then in objective 3, it's to develop spatially explicit estimates of propagule pressure per pathway and try and understand if we can identify what we would call hotspots of release activity across the Canadian landscape. So why are we focusing on these three pathways? Well, I mean, it's been understood for a number of years that organisms in trade represent both a very large and a very important set of invasion pathways. In 2010, there was an estimate of 2 billion live ornamental fishes moved worldwide each year. Some work from about 10 years ago in Nick Mandrak's lab estimated that we had over 1,600 fish species imported to Canada each year through these different trades. And then in 2018, Stats Canada estimated that the live ornamental fish import was worth almost $10 million Canadian. And moreover, and probably more concerning, we've seen demonstrated invasions of organisms in trade in Canada's aquatic ecosystems. So whether we're talking about tench or goldfish or mystery snail or frogbit, we have a history of species in trade escaping to the wild and establishing reproducing populations. And so this does represent a priority in terms of understanding some of the scientific elements that underlie these invasions in the wild. Okay, so to start, when we think about trade and we think about the movement of species globally and how they get to Canada, this diagram is just showing kind of our conceptual framework of a kind of a basic construct of the trade network. So we can think about organisms in trade originate in a source country, so a country outside of Canada. Those organisms are intentionally shipped, transported to an initial Canadian port of entry. Um, from that initial port of entry, they are typically distributed then to a distribution hub. The distribution hub will then further distribute species to retailers. So these could be aquarium stores, water garden supply companies, grocery store chains that sell live seafood, etc. And then these live organisms are purchased by end users, basically members of the Canadian public that either own aquariums, own water gardens, or consume live food, live aquatic food. And so our analysis framework, kind of thinking about this model and this network, is to start by thinking about the source countries, the ports of entry, and distributors being informed by existing species import records. So thankfully, these pathways have very detailed species import records that are collected both by the Canada Border Services Agency and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And those records are available for us to conduct analysis on. We can then estimate the number and the spatial distribution of retailers through kind of conventional internet-based address searches. And then to understand the spatial distribution of end users and where releases might be happening, we used a different approach where we compiled some data through existing literature. We looked at Canadian census data of the Canadian human population and then constructed a basic model to understand where these end users live and how likely it is that they may be releasing.
All right, Andrew.
Okay.
Oh,
Yep.
sorry. Yeah, do you mind just hiding that like bar at the bottom of your screen? Just missed a, yeah,
Oh, perfect.
yeah, perfect.
Sorry, I didn't realize everyone could see that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
all good. Thanks.
Thank you. So to start, the first part of this analysis framework is species import records. And again, we were very fortunate to have access to CBSA's Pathfinder database. This is a database that provides records of commercial trade. It has a series of HS codes associated with it. These are codes that help categorize different types of imports. As well, there was a description of the imported good, so providing more information beyond something like an HS code. It had information on the origin of the shipment and its destination. Um, and this was a very detailed log of species imports into Canada for the period from July to October of 2018. So we basically had a very detailed 4-month period of import records. We also had access to the CFIA summarized data. So this data spanned a 10-year period. It included HS and other government department codes, and we use this more as a ground truthing database in our analysis. This is just an example. When I talk about HS codes, these are the type of codes that are typically found in these import databases. So they're not necessarily detailed enough to allow species level or species to be identified outright. Often that information would have to be obtained from other detailed information provided with the import. Another challenge that we had is these HS codes don't always provide kind of a definitive understanding of whether the organisms are in fact live or if they were imported dead. Of course, we were interested in the live organisms. So there was quite a bit of kind of ground truthing and expert judgment required to figure out which of these shipments were in fact live aquatic organisms. Okay, the next step was to identify both the number and spatial distribution of retailers. Again, this was done through a basic address and web search, largely an internet-based search. Aquarium stores spanned everything from something like a Big Al's aquarium store to, a PetSmart or a Pet Value, anything that's selling ornamental fishes for the purpose of those being kept for hobbies. Water gardens could also include conventional aquarium retailers, depending on the purpose of the plants that are sold, but also can include nurseries. So many nurseries will have live aquatic plants for sale. And then our live food retailers really included grocery store chains that are selling live aquatic organisms. Okay, the next step was to develop our approach for modeling propagule pressure. So the steps you've seen so far are really kind of sorting through import records and understanding how species move through primary ports of entry to distributors and then retailers. This step is thinking about what do we know about end users, meaning members of the Canadian public. How many people own aquariums? How many people own water gardens? And so this approach involved really working with census data from Statistics Canada. So we focused on the 2016 census program, looked at the number and spatial distribution of households in Canada. And then we came up with a really simple framework to try and estimate how many of those Canadian households would actually be aquarium owners. So this involved estimating the proportion of those households that own aquaria and having a kind of a correction or an additional step for whether you are found in an urban versus a rural area. This is important because some of these pathways are more heavily participated in if you're in a rural area. So something like water gardens, simply because there's more space available in a rural area. Um, the next step was to understand, so step 3 here is the probability that you would be a releaser, given that you are either an aquarium owner, a water garden owner, or a live seafood consumer. So it allowed us to think about, of those total number of users participating in the activity, what proportion are actually releasers. And then the final step, labeled propagule size, is to think about, well, how many organisms are actually released during a release event. Is it 0? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? And so on. And some of the literature that we pulled really had quite informative information around current statistics on these 3 trades. So really apologize for all the text, but I thought people would be kind of interested with the actual values that we started with. So for the aquarium pathway, some existing surveys estimated that about 10.6 of US households owned aquaria, and this was as far back as 1994. So it is a very old and out of date survey in a different country. Nonetheless, it provided a starting point for us. Some survey work that DFO had done in 2009 showed that 86 and 14% of aquarium owners resided in urban and then rural areas respectively. And that's important because that distribution of urban versus rural ownership actually aligns very closely with the pattern of residents of Canadians in general in urban versus rural areas. So basically, population density is kind of perfectly aligned with patterns of aquarium ownership in Canada. Now, different surveys have suggested that between 0.8% and 7% of aquarium owners will release their organisms. Some work from McGill showed that on average, about 5% of the fishes that are owned will be released, and that the most common number of organisms to be released during an event is 1, so a single individual. On the water garden side, so previous surveys have suggested either 3.9 or 14.4% of US households own water gardens in 1998 and 2003. That 14.4% number does seem quite high. What is more interesting here is that we see the 74 and 26% urban to rural ratio there. So again, more water garden owners are living in rural areas than conventional pop density statistics would suggest. So there's kind of a rural bias towards water garden ownership in Canada. And again, based on a DFO survey, between 1.3 and 2.8% of water garden owners release plants and animals. So live food, finally, 88% of surveyed Canadians have consumed seafood in a 3-month period, but of the seafood that's sold in retailers, only 4% of the seafood that's sold would constitute live seafood. So lots of seafood being consumed, but a much smaller fraction of it is purchased live. Obviously, it's not consumed live, but it's purchased live. And again, that urban-rural ratio aligns very closely with the background pattern of population density in Canada. So what did all this mean for us? Well, we had to make some decisions around the statistics we were using to model propagule pressure in these pathways. And so for the aquarium survey, we assumed, again, that 10.5% participation rate was valid for Canada. And that is an assumption. And a lot of this work describes just how uncertain we are about some of these statistics that are important for understanding the scope and scale of these pathways. We assumed an urban to rural ratio of 86:14. The probability of release, given that you're an aquarium owner, we assumed to be 3.9%, and the propagule size distribution was on average a value of 3, but this meant that the most likely release number was 1 individual. For the water garden pathway, we assumed that lower rate of participation based on the US survey, recognizing some of the climate limitation to water garden ownership in Canada. Again, we used the heavily weighted towards the rural ownership relative to Canadian population density. We assumed a 3.9% release rate similar to aquaria, and the same propagule size distribution. Now, for live food, a much lower participation rate compared to aquaria, so 3.5%, generally a similar urban to rural ratio, and we assumed, again, the same 3.9% release rate. One final point on the methods here is that, we understand that water gardening in Canada is limited by climate. And so we limited the potential geographic extent of water garden ownership to plant hardiness zones 2A through 9. And that was based on some background work we had done with the province of Ontario, looking at patterns and spatial distribution of water gardens in Ontario. Okay, so I went through the methods really quickly. I want people to be aware that all of this work is publicly available and published, and I'll point to a link at the end of this presentation. I haven't gone into a lot of methods detail because I think what people are going to be really interested in is just seeing the results and what we think these results mean in terms of the importance of these pathways. So I'll start with the aquarium pathway. So what did we find through the review of trade records? Well, during the 4-month period of investigation, we determined that 4.3 million aquarium organisms are distributed to Canada from 40 source countries. And kind of an interesting stat is that Canada, given this 4-month snapshot, is connected to all continents except for Antarctica via the aquarium trade. The top 3 source countries were the United States by far, followed by Indonesia and Sri Lanka. And, an important caveat here is that these source countries don't necessarily mean that the organisms that are being shipped to Canada are from those source countries. So there could be other forms of trade that are allowing different species to be cultured, for example, in other countries that are then being shipped to Canada. So we can't infer kind of species native source from these trade patterns. All we know is that these shipments are coming from these source countries, and it really helps us understand, either in a forecasting or a backcasting sense, how connected Canada is to different countries in terms of its global aquarium trade. Okay, when we break things down further and look at the ports of entry, we can see there were three kind of dominant ports of entry for aquarium fishes. So Windsor, Ontario, Mirabel, Quebec, and Calgary, Alberta. And, if you look at the number of source countries that each of those are connected to, it sets up kind of this interesting dilemma, if you will, where Windsor has this large number of organisms kind of coming across its border, but from a very small number of countries, whereas something like Alberta, or sorry, Calgary rather, has a lower number of organisms, but coming across many more countries. In terms of distribution hubs, we found that aquarium organisms were occasionally moved beyond the province where they were originally entered into Canada. And main distribution hubs for aquarium fishes were in Innisfil, Ontario, LaSalle, Quebec, and Calgary, Alberta. The pattern of aquarium retailers in Canada was really interesting. We identified about 1,100 retailers that aggregated around major cities. And so one of the kind of ongoing themes of this work is that these are trades that are fundamentally centered around where people live. And so demand for these species links very tightly with patterns of human population density, which links very tightly with where distributors are located, uh, where the major ports of entry are, and therefore where the retailers are. Most of these retailers are close to larger population centers. And so even though I'm not focused on species in this work, because what we're really trying to understand is the pathway itself and the kind of the network of flows and the number of nodes in the network. I think it is for illustration's sake interesting to look at the number of species that we identified. So 741 aquarium species were identified in that 4-month snapshot through the Pathfinder data. Of these, we had 585 fishes, 100 invertebrates, and 56 plant species. And what was interesting is that 190 fish species had not been reported in past studies on live fish imports in Canada. And that could represent kind of a one-time shift in trade, or simply that when you really dig into the details, we see, turnover in terms of the number of species that may be popular, and that may change through time. Okay, so thinking now about end users. So how many people in Canada are actually participating in these pathways? Well, let's start with aquarium owners. So based on that 10.6% participation rate, we estimate that there are about 1.5 million households owning aquaria in Canada. That number, of course, could be lower if the overall participation rate is lower, and it could be higher if participation rates are higher. And this kind of sensitivity analysis that we've provided here helps us work through, as we learn more about the true rate, that true underlying rate of participation, how many households do we think that relates to in terms of patterns across Canada? The spatial distribution of aquarium owners aligned very closely again with patterns of human population density. So whether we assumed, the 10.6 participation rate in the top left, or the 5% in the bottom left, and the 15 in the top right, the point here is that those darkest squares, those dark grids, those cells that contain the greatest number of households really do align very closely with the high density urban centers in Canada. So what about the number of releasing households? So, we have this estimate of about 1.5 households that participate in aquarium ownership. What does it mean in terms of release? Well, based on an assumed 3.9% release rate, and again, that's based on some of the survey data we were working with, we estimate that there are about 60,000 households that will release aquarium organisms in a given year. And again, if the release rate differs from 3.9, it could be higher. I mean, we could be looking at over 100,000. If it's much lower, we could be looking at, as little as 11,000. So really goes to show that release rate uh, really matters in terms of the number of households that actually participate in release. The spatial distribution of releasers. So what you're looking at here is a map of where these release events are happening based on kind of this modeling framework. So you can see that again, they're aligning very closely with these patterns of human population density and the patterns of aquarium ownership in Canada. Um, most of these releases are happening in major urban centers. And FARA was able to use some really neat spatial statistics to identify what we called hotspots of aquarium releases. So these are areas that are kind of statistically identifiable as containing a greater number of releases per unit area than other areas that are part of the landscape. And so, it's really no surprise to me when I look at this map that these hotspots of aquarium releases all align with major urban centers in Canada. In BC, Victoria, Vancouver, Alberta, Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatchewan, Regina, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of activity in the Greater Toronto Area, lots of activity in the large cities in Quebec. What was really cool about this result is that the hotspots themselves, so these areas that are important, really didn't change based on different assumptions around that release rate. So, if release rates are as high as 7% or as low as 0.8%, that really didn't matter in terms of where physically these releases are happening, mostly in Canada. And so finally, we can take all this work and combine it together to come up with these statistical estimates of propagule pressure per year. And so the top panel here is probably the most important. That's showing our baseline estimate that given 58,000 households that we believe to be releasing per year, that we think there's about 183,000 aquarium organisms that are released to Canadian ecosystems in a given year. That number could be higher depending on the distribution of propagule size we assume. So if most of the time people are releasing more than one organism, obviously that number starts to climb. Now, a really important caveat, and I'll be sure to come back to this at the end of the presentation, is that not all of these species are surviving. Not all of these species are establishing populations. Not all of these species will establish in kind of an invasive status, if you will. But these propagule pressure estimates are really important to help us compare among different pathways in Canada and understand the scope and scale of propagule releases just as an outright statistic. Okay, moving on. So we've covered the aquarium pathway. So now we're going to dive into the water garden pathway results. And you're going to see the same series of slides, kind of the same output metrics from this modeling work. So in terms of the global trade that's ending up in Canada, we had 3.7 million water garden organisms from 19 source countries during that 4-month period of June to October 2018. Three source countries were, the top 3 source countries were the United States, Thailand, and Germany. And again, the same caveat here for the aquarium fishes, which is that these source countries aren't necessarily the native source of these organisms that are being shipped into Canada. In terms of ports of entry, Windsor, Mirabel, and Calgary were the top 3 ports, similar to the aquarium pathway. And again, you see that, Calgary, for some reason, has this kind of diversity of source countries associated with it, whereas Windsor and Mirabel are only a single source. I suspect that's the United States, but I'm not sure. I'd have to go back to the appendix. And in terms of distribution hubs for water garden organisms, we saw that occasionally they're moved beyond the port of entry to a different province within Canada. And the top 3 distribution hubs here being Innisfil, LaSalle, and Calgary. Okay, we identified about 1,200 retailers selling water garden organisms, very similar patterns to the aquarium pathway. So these stores are really kind of responding to aspects of supply and demand. So they are centered around major urban areas and obviously the greater number of stores and concentration of stores in areas where we have the greatest human population density. Some examples of water garden species that we documented are shown here. So about 400 species in total, 145 fishes, 3 invertebrates, and 52 plants. Okay, so how many Canadians are actually participating in water gardening? Well, we estimated over 500,000 households owned water gardens in Canada. That number is very sensitive to that assumed participation rate. So if it's as high as, a 14.4% rate, you could be looking at over 2 million households. If it's as low as 2%, it might only be 250,000. So that number of owners is obviously very sensitive to that overall participation rate. The spatial distribution of water garden owners looks pretty similar to the distribution of aquarium owners. Of course, we did have that climate-based cutoff here where water garden ownership was precluded beyond a given kind of latitudinal extent just because of climate factors. But the key here is that a lot of activity is happening in the southern part of Canada and does relate to patterns of human population density. So when we extrapolate this again, we think we're looking at about 20,000 households that are releasing water garden organisms in a given year. And again, that number can fluctuate based on that probability of release value that is assumed. Here's where the water garden releases are likely to be occurring under these different release statistics. A lot of activity in southwestern Ontario, right up through the kind of the Great Lakes Basin, St. Lawrence River area. A lot of activity in some of the big kind of densely populated areas in BC and Alberta and even Saskatchewan. And the hotspots for water garden release aligned very closely with the hotspots for aquarium release. So again, we have these statistically identifiable areas where water garden releases are much more likely to occur. These are all centered on the major urban centers in Canada. What's different here is that because we have a rural bias to ownership, these are not happening necessarily right in kind of the urban core, but kind of on the outskirts, right? So we know that it's the rural areas that are close by these urban areas that tend to have more water garden ownership and therefore more releases. And finally, extending this work through, we have this estimate of about 66,000 water garden organisms released through this pathway in a given year in Canada. Okay, and the final set of results here, the live food pathway. So for live food in Canada, we documented 82 million live food organisms originating from 21 source countries. The vast majority of our live food imports came from the United States. But again, you can see some global representation there in terms of where some of these shipments are originating from. The top 3 ports of entry were Ottawa, Ontario, Richmond, BC, and St. Stephen, New Brunswick. And the top distribution hubs were Montebello, Quebec, Chilliwack, BC, and Cap Pele, New Brunswick. We documented 2,300 retailers. Again, they're aggregating very closely around these major cities. So same dynamics in terms of demand and supply at play here in terms of where live aquatic food retailers are located across the landscape. We documented 86 live food species, 32 fishes, and 54 invertebrates in the Pathfinder data. So how many individuals are actually purchasing live seafood? Well, if we assume, again, this 3.5% participation rate, we estimate that there are about 1.2 million individuals that would purchase live seafood. That value can really vary depending on that assumed participation rate. That number of households purchasing live seafood varies in terms of spatial distribution depending on that assumed participation rate. But again, most of those kind of dark grid cells are centered around urban centers in Canada. We think given an assumed rate of 3.9%, so of the Canadians that are consuming live food, 3.9% may release, that this then relates to 48,000 households that will release live seafood organisms in Canada. These releasers are matching very closely with the patterns of live seafood consumption across Canada. So again, I seem to be saying this a lot, but a lot of very strong alignment between release patterns and patterns of human population density. And we see many of the same hotspots for live seafood releases that we saw for both the aquarium and the water garden pathways in Canada. Our final estimate of propagule pressure per year was about 151,000 organisms released, and that number, can vary strongly depending on how many individuals are actually released in a given release event, right? So if you only release a single organism versus 3 or 4 or 5, that distribution really matters in terms of the overall scope and scale of this pathway. Okay, so just to summarize, through this work, we've estimated that 4 million, 3.7 million, and 82 million aquarium, water garden, and live food organisms are imported over a 4-month period in Canada. We've found fairly significant global connectivity with these live aquatic species imports, and especially for the aquarium trade. Of these imports, and based on patterns of ownership, we estimate 183,000, 66,000, and 151,000 aquatic organisms released per year via these 3 pathways. And I think one of the really important take-homes of this work is that there is a very strong relationship between where release is happening and the underlying patterns of human population density. So when we think about how human population density is predicted to change in Canada over the next 20 or 50 years, that has implications in terms of the volume of these pathways and potentially how release rates are changing unless there's strong interventions to kind of break that cycle and break that chain. Um, I think an important point with this work is that, like most invasion pathways, seemingly rare events start to become very meaningful. And what I mean by that is that, most Canadians don't own aquariums, and most aquarium owners are not releasing. It's only a subset of users that are actually releasing, and it's only a subset of those released organisms that may survive and establish and become invasive. The problem that we're dealing with here is that you have such a large number of Canadians in general, and even a 10% participation rate, a 3% release rate. Those small numbers start to become very important given simply the population size that we're dealing with in Canada. As I mentioned earlier, a really important point here is that not all imported species can survive in Canada. Therefore, not all of these species will become invasive. Many of the released species will not survive due to, inhospitable environmental conditions. A lot of aquarium species are tropical. Not all, but a lot of them are. And so there's a very poor climate match. So, I think these release statistics are important and they're very telling, and we certainly can't ignore them. At the same time, not all of these species are surviving, and this kind of leads to the next bit of work that we're doing on these pathways, which is to try and figure out, which of these imported species have the greatest probability of survival. But nonetheless, I think this project provides really important context about the structure of the trade networks, and even the incidence of control points, right? The idea that all of these, millions of organisms are coming through a small number of ports of entry per year. And DFO has been working very closely with CBSA on how to handle some of these live trade imports, and improving our approaches to kind of document and screen shipments that are coming across Canada's borders. Of course, like any modeling work, there are lots of uncertainties. The parameters that we've used to estimate propagule pressure are, of course, very uncertain due to older survey data that was derived in the United States, well, not Canada. And one of the reasons we conducted the sensitivity analysis is really to provide the setup for future surveys to say, if we know that the participation rate is different than the rate we used in this analysis, then we have an easy kind of plug and play way of understanding what that means in terms of total activity in Canada. there continues to be lots of uncertainty around true ownership and release rates themselves. There's all kinds of challenges with trying to understand what humans are doing in terms of release rates. We have to deal with things like good behavior during surveys or, untruthful responses. And those are all very real issues, which suggest that we may never know the true release rate, but we might have to be comfortable with knowing that it's somewhere below 10%, for example, and that is still a concern. The final 2 points I want to make is that we didn't include what I would call vandalistic actors. So we didn't include, like, anyone can kind of walk off the street and buy an aquarium fish. You don't have to own an aquarium necessarily to purchase an aquarium fish, although a lot of retailers do a good job of making sure that you are a responsible aquarium owner. And so, there are circumstances where people who might really not support the goals of invasive species management, or might simply want live fishes for release purposes, like perhaps prey release, may be purchasing these species and not consider themselves as aquarium owners. And so those types of scenarios are really not included in this analysis. We also weren't able to effectively include online sales and school supplies or other biological supply houses. So there is a kind of a fraction of live trade for these three pathways that we still haven't accounted for in this work. So next steps, what I've shown you today these are bulk propagule pressure estimates. So they're looking at all of the species combined. And I think they're very useful for providing those broad kind of first cut comparisons among different pathways like the ballast water pathway in Canada. But we of course need to divide these at the species level and say, okay, for any given species that is contained, can we develop a species specific estimate? The next step, of course, and we're doing some of this work now, is to then run conventional risk assessments on the full set of species in trade. And we have some work right now looking at climate match, improving climate match methods, and looking at using climate match to run the top species to understand which of the species with greatest propagule pressure have a high probability of survival within Canada. As I mentioned, I really skimmed through the methods, and if you're interested in the gory details, so to speak, I encourage folks to download the research document. This work is all described in that document. It's publicly available from the Fisheries and Oceans Canada Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat website, and it provides all of the kind of assumptions that we used and the methods, as well as some of the species occurrence data that we used in developing this work. I'd of course be happy to answer any questions, and my email address is listed there at the bottom of the slide. And lastly, just like to acknowledge a number of individuals that really helped us do this work. Helen Gerson from CBSA and Krista Jackson were very helpful in terms of working with trade data. Len Hunt from OMNRF in terms of his expertise on modeling human processes. Tessa Brinklow, again, who helped us compile the trade data. Members of the DFO team that reviewed this research document. And lastly, the Invasive Species Center for the opportunity to give this webinar. So thanks very much, and happy to take questions if we have any time.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was yeah, a massive amount of work and data, and just it's an overwhelming pathway. It's there's so much to it, eh? We do have a couple of questions that came through, so I can read them out to you if that works, and then we can yeah, spend a few minutes on that. Okay, so the first question I think you kind of touched on a little bit, in terms of ponds, were ponds considered as part of the water garden pathway? Specifically, I guess maybe just to speak to the rural side of that, were ponds considered in that data?
Yeah, and in most of the water garden activity, I would say is found in ponds. Whether these are ponds that are part of an outdoor garden or just separate ponds on a rural property, all of that was included. And the water garden pathway is just a challenging one in that what we don't have a good handle on is what people are doing with their water garden plants during the winter. So there's cases where either plants or fish in those ponds are kind of being kept out over the winter. There's other cases where people are actually bringing them indoors. And that question is relevant whether we're talking about ponds or more contained garden areas. But yes, those were all considered in terms of these estimates.
Great, thanks. Okay, so would you imagine that the source countries differ a lot from a similar analysis that was done for another country than other than Canada? So that's a bit of a different different
Yeah, I
side of
mean,
things.
that's a really good question. I mean, I think I often feel outside of my element as a, with an ecology background, because really what we're getting into are kind of the economics of trade and trade patterns and what drives trade. And that's certainly not my background and my expertise. I think if you were to look at any country, you would probably see the same type of distribution where you probably have the bulk of their imports that are driven by one or two countries. So for Canada, it's, the bulk of ours are coming from the United States. But then it's kind of that classic right tail distribution where you then have a whole bunch of other countries that are kind of distributed at a low level. Or connected at a low level, meaning a few imports per year, kind of a one-off shipment. We don't really know why. There's a trade connection there. Is it important? Well, it's tough to say without knowing what species are actually contained.
Yeah, again, sounds like just really hard to keep track of in general. Yeah. Okay, so our next question, how does the water garden pathway differentiated from the aquarium trade when it comes to specific species like goldfish?
Yeah, great question, because we had a lot of challenges differentiating the two, and I should have been more clear that there is definitely some double counting that is happening with our analysis. So goldfish were considered in the aquarium pathway. They were also considered Goldfish purchases were considered in the water garden pathway, and we had a real challenge separating those species. Um, and even some of the retailers, right? Because some of the aquarium retailers may well supply species for water garden purposes, even though their intent is aquarium supply. Um, the research document does go through kind of the details we use to try and keep those separate and where kind of overlap and double counting existed. So, but it was a real challenge. It's rare to go up to a retailer and it's like aquarium only and water garden only. Like we didn't have that kind of separation, so that was tough to work through.
Yeah, absolutely. Even at the nurseries you mentioned as well, not always, a place that you expect to see these species, especially for water gardens. Yeah. Another question, kind of more relative to innovative thinking, I guess. Are there species lists that you are using? Are there species lists you are using being verified using ocular character recognition or other AI methods?
Yeah, so I'm glad this is raised as a question. One of there's many uncertainties with this work, and a big one is that the description of goods would often have information around scientific or common name. But a really important caveat, and one of the reasons that I did not focus on species identities in this presentation, is that those identities were not independently verified by a taxonomist. So, if the shipping label is incorrect, the species identities will be off, and everything kind of breaks down. And so, I think there's a lot of promise for whether it's AI or eDNA to try and improve the way we can ground truth some of these shipments. Of course, that does come at the expense of slowing down trade, and there is a balance there. Um, but I think definitely there's work to be done in terms of really validating what the record says versus what's actually contained in the shipment. And that's something that we're not working on at the moment, but I know CBSA is really interested in, and there's different folks from DFO that are really interested in moving that forward.
Great. Yeah, okay, we've got three more, so I'll try to power through here. So have you considered comparing your anticipated release hotspots with new detections in Canada to see if these two align or diverge? Likely there'd be observer bias, but maybe that's an important result of needing to improve AIS surveillance.
Yeah, it's super question and great idea. I mean, I think what what would be ideal is so there's two ways you could do it. You could take the hotspots and relate that to invasion rate or observed invasions and say, is there a correlation here? That would be the kind of the least direct approach. The more direct approach would be to actually layer on survival and establishment, and then ask, once we do that, are these release hotspots still in fact hotspots for now, not just release, but establishments, and do those predicted establishments match with actual establishments? And, I think there's good reason to do that because we want to know that the models are performing well. The challenges with doing that is that detected species can show up in the environment from different mechanisms. So for example, you can have a goldfish detection where goldfish have naturally dispersed to that area, not been the result of an aquarium release. And so depending on kind of the spatial scale you use, that could suggest, well, your model doesn't work. It's like, no, the model works well. It's just that goldfish detection happened to be the result of a different kind of pathway. So, these are the many challenges of working with pathways and trying to validate our estimates, that your observed invasions can be the result of many different processes, not necessarily the pathway that you're modeling.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, definitely. So just another one here, kind of similar. Given all the customs paperwork required for bulk import shipping and even online shipments, how hard would it be to have a box to tick certifying that the species in question are known to be non-invasive?
Yeah, I mean that is the
Regularly.
question, right? And that's I certainly won't answer on behalf of DFO regulators, but there is a lot of concern right now with this pathway, and DFO Science's role is to support managers both federally and provincially to understand how can we improve on this issue. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can improve on it, right? So obviously the borders represent critical control points. It's a logical place to screen a really large number of species. But like most invasion management, it's going to be multifaceted, where we're still going to have to work on education around release. We're still going to have to work on enforcement around release in the wild and all that. So
Yeah, for sure. And just one last one, I'm just grabbing from the chat. There's a couple more. I'm hoping maybe if folks aren't seeing their questions answered, if they could reach out, hopefully that's okay with you, Dr. Drake. But just one more. Which data source would have the most impact in improving the accuracy of your estimates of propagule pressure?
oh, that's a good question. I think we did look at that, but my memory is a bit hazy in the research document. I mean, so the rate of participation and the rate of release generally have the same effect because they're kind of one-to-one modifiers. Um, so those are kind of equal in terms of their importance. The bigger one is actually knowing how many organisms are released per event, because if we're getting into the multiples per event, and if that's common, and I don't think it is, but if it is, then that really matters, because that can take those end propagule pressure estimates and really ramp them up, like double them pretty easily. Um, that also is one of the hardest rates to resolve, because people are not always very forthcoming about their release activity, especially once they learn that it's illegal.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's such great information. Thank you so much again for answering all those questions. I'll just share my screen again so everybody can see our next webinar. So thank you again for joining. Oh, here we go. There we go. Thank you again for listening. It's great to have everybody on board, and thanks so much for the discussion and answering all those questions, Dr. Drake. In terms of our next webinar, so we have a bacterial immune system can now help identify invasive plants, weeds, and other pests. So it's going to be a great presentation, September 18th, same time, same place. So we hope to see everybody there, and thanks again for your participation today.
Thanks, Jenna. Have a
Thanks.
great day.
Cheers.